81, really on the evening of Shavuot. Operation Opera, as it was codenamed in Israel, was launched. Don't ask why. There apparently is some computer-generated name for wars and operations in Israel. I don't know where they got opera from. 8 F-15s and 8 F-16s took off from Israel, flew 2,000 kilometers, that's what, 1,250 miles or so, to Iraq. Within 2 minutes, they dropped 10 tons of bomb on the reactor in Osirak. And you remember the movie Star Wars, the first one with Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher back in 1977. I saw it as a teenager. And that scene where the Millennium Falcon, whatever, Luke Skywalker is the last of the pilots and he's about to kind of take off and they're not sure they're going to knock off the Death Star. And just as he drops the bomb, he managed to get out in time and boom, that's kind of what happened. The last pilot here was a young man named Ilan Ramon, who eventually became an astronaut, who went into outer space with, I think Challenger was called, in 2003, and tragically was killed upon re-entry, the Israeli astronaut Ilan Ramon. He was the point man, really, in that operation in 1981. The Prime Minister, Menachem Begin, who we saw last week, in that mahapach, that revolution of the political right taking power for the first time in Israeli history, Begin came under a lot of domestic criticism because it was in the midst of an election campaign, but also a lot of international criticism. And he said quite clearly to the public, he said, listen, we've lifted it and ensured there won't be a second Holocaust, and the sword has been lifted off of our necks. Here's a map you can see across Saudi Arabia, very, very low, undetected by radar, going to Osirak and coming back, 8 planes altogether. Here we can see a picture of a plane that participated in that, the kills of the pilots of those particular planes. And here you can see this is commemorating that Operation Opera. Only 16 planes had that. Saddam Hussein, remember, dictator of Iraq at the time, told us that we shouldn't be concerned. The Iranians, remember, there was a war going on between Iraq and Iran at the time. You guys shouldn't fear a nuclear reactor. We don't plan to use it against you, Iran, only against the Israeli enemy. The operation, thankfully, averted the nuclear threat to Israel for many, many years. We'll see, I think next week in 2007, a similar operation was undertaken here in Syria, much closer to home, but same idea. Israel publicly admitted it happened. And there's talk, as we speak, of planning potentially of another attack there. Some of you might have seen the show Tehran, an Israeli-produced TV show about an Israeli spy in Iran, and it's in the news all of the time, what's going on between Israel and Iran. I, of course, am particularly concerned because A, the safety of Israel, and B, we Israelis have skin in the game, and our youngest son has another 2 months until he gets out of the military, and he's in the Air Force Search and Rescue, and his job is to extricate downed pilots. So hopefully in enemy territory. Hopefully they won't be called up for any action in the not too distant future. The world condemned it. The LA Times, close to home, called it as a state-sponsored terrorism. The General Assembly, there was actually only one main voice in public. Jerry Falwell, you might remember, of the moral majority, came out in favor of Israel. So it's something that Israel did because it felt it had to defend itself, but heavily criticized all over the world. Next summer, the major event is launched called Operation Peace for the Galilee. Most of us in most history books today would call it the First Lebanese War, the first war in Lebanon. June 6, 1942. The ongoing terrorism from Lebanon, which we've talked about in previous weeks, continues. And the cabinet decides what to do. Eventually, the Israeli ambassador, Shlomo Argov, was critically wounded in London. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. The cabinet decided to launch a limited operation with an Air Force airstrike into southern Lebanon. At the time, the PLO, based in southern Lebanon, shelled all across northern Israel. And so Israel, the government said, we'll launch at 40 kilometers, about 25 miles, a little bit less than a marathon for you runners. Well, you runners know that that's almost a marathon. And the operation aimed to try to take over and get rid of, from southern Lebanon, the terror bases that we talked about last week that the PLO had built entrenched into southern Lebanon. In fact, one of the major battles was the Beaufort, a Crusader area fortress in southern Lebanon, where the Prime Minister, Begin, was told by the defense minister that it was an unbelievable battle, not a single Israeli fatality. Unfortunately, actually, Begin was there, unbeknownst to him, 6 Israeli soldiers, which is a significant number in Israel, were killed in that battle. So already in the early days, something funny was going on. It seems to be quite clear that the defense minister, Sharon, had plans that he didn't disclose to the prime minister. You'll see that in a few minutes, and the cabinet. 3 days later, Syria almost got involved, although it was a war not against the state of Lebanon. It was an operation designed to remove the PLO from southern Lebanon. But of course, the main supporters of the PLO in southern Lebanon was Syria. And so Israeli Air Force attacked Syrian missile batteries, and one of the biggest dogfights ever in aviation history. Israel shot down over 100 Syrian/Soviet designed planes without losing a single plane, right? 100 to 0, absolutely phenomenal. Kind of building on the success of the 1967 surprise attack. I remember, many of you probably remember, Philip Habib, the American of Lebanese origin, who reached an agreement according to which the PLO evacuated by sea from Beirut in the summer of 1982. But a vacuum was created in southern Lebanon, which we'll see, that one, which we will see in, which we'll see in just a few minutes' time. There we see Prime Minister Begin and Defense Minister Sharon touring around the Beaufort Castle early June in the early days of the war. At the beginning, and I think one could say this about every single Israeli war/operation, the majority of Israelis are behind it. The straw breaks the camel's back. Enough is enough. Too many rockets coming from southern Lebanon to northern Israel. Terrorist infiltrations. They're trying to knock off our ambassador. We can't stand for this. We've got to go get rid of the terrorists. Okay, but as it escalates and it turns into not just Israel removing the PLO, but an internal battle within Lebanon, initiated, supported, orchestrated perhaps by Israel, trying to influence the regime control in Lebanon, wanting to boost Israel, wanting to boost the strength and strengthen the Christian power vis-a-vis the Shiites and the Sunnis or the Palestinian nationalists in Lebanon. And so as Israeli soldiers stand watch, 3 months into the war, 3.5 months into the war, 1,000 Palestinians in the 2 refugee camps in Beirut are massacred by Christian Phalangist militia. And it's at that point that people in Israel realize, wait a minute, this isn't just getting rid of 25 miles of terror bases on our border. It's actually going into the capital. It's actually sitting and watching by as Lebanese kill Lebanese. We don't really want to be there. And unlike the early wars in 67 and 73, the campaign lasted longer, and it actually had more casualties than the 1967 Six-Day War. It really was the first, what many historians call the war of choice, in that Israel wasn't about to be attacked in 67, wasn't attacked as in 48. You can maybe call the 56 Suez operation, when Israel colluded with France and England against Egypt after it nationalized the Suez Canal. But this really was a war of choice. We're going to use massive military force to get rid of the PLO. And it didn't really achieve that much militarily. Politically, you could say it got rid of the PLO. But ultimately, Israel withdrew about 2.5 years later in January of 1985 from most of Lebanon, keeping a very narrow, about 5-7 mile wide security barrier in northern Lebanon. Conceptually, if the Israeli soldiers are in southern Lebanon, they'll be the barrier between terrorists in Lebanon and civilians in northern Israel. And ultimately, only in May of 2000 did Israel withdraw. And because of what was going on in Lebanon, the largest protest ever, at that time is probably about 8-10% of Israeli population. In September of 1982, actually, I was there, believe it or not, called for a commission of inquiry to be established in order to determine what happened in Lebanon. How do we make sure it doesn't happen once again? Ultimately, the commission realized, placed blame for what was going on inside of Lebanon, very much at the feet of the defense minister, Ariel Sharon, and they decided that, I cut out the last line, sorry, that he should resign. He did. He became other ministers in the government. Years later, of course, he came back to be the prime minister. But it really was a war that divided Israel internally, unlike any other war. And I think it's axiomatic to say that the longer any war/operation continues, the more divided Israelis are over our ability to win or to have any further gains in the war. I mean, conceptually, from a military point of view, the Israeli military doctrine is there are a couple elements that are really important, and there are a number, but one is wage war, have the battle in the enemy's territory, because we don't have any room to spare, quite simply. Number two, finish what has to be done as quickly as possible. We don't have the wherewithal for a long, think of the Iran-Iraq war, 1 million people over what, a decade? We don't have the manpower and the financial resources to continue for a very, very long time. And keep in mind, the nature of the Israel Defense Forces. A lot of the soldiers are reservists, people who come in for a military operation and training. They're not, kids in the standing army. So this became quite a dividing issue within Israel back in 19. Your screen sharing is paused. Sorry about that one. I want to stop that one. Resume share. Sorry about that. I'm having a problem with these things today. Okay. 1985. Israel is still in southern Lebanon, but left most of Lebanon. A new organization called Hezbollah. Hizb is Arabic for party. Allah, God, of course, there's their flag. You can see it's not exactly the flag of Pete Seeger and the Weavers in the 1960s. There's the globe, and there is the Arabic written, and there is the Kalashnikov rifle, right, by force, take over the world. The Shiite world, the Muslim world should be more Shiite than Sunni. But the idea develops amongst clerics who are studying in Najaf in Iran, inspired by Khomeini, who, is abroad and then comes back and leads the Iranian revolution in the late 1970s. And ultimately, Iran funds this organization and send members of the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, to set up the organization. It's the same Revolutionary Guard we keep hearing about in the Middle East today, by the way. It's kind of like the French Foreign Legion with very different purposes by the Iranian Revolution. It's the main arm of exporting military terror, technology, personnel, weapons, whatever, outside of Iran. And I think to understand Hezbollah, we must realize that Hezbollah is kind of like a state within a state. They participate in the democratic elections of Lebanon. They're part of the cabinet. For example, not these elections, but I think 2 years ago, elections in Lebanon, 13, so almost 10% of the seats in parliament are taken up by Hezbollah. They had 2 cabinet posts. And you remember the tragedy in the port of Lebanon and Beirut of last year. Couple hundred people were killed, thousands were injured. Much of downtown Beirut was leveled, and they're having a commission of inquiry as we speak. And there was violence in the streets a week or 10 days ago in Beirut between Shiite militias and everybody else. And there's still a lot of tension inside of Lebanon. And a lot of people are coming up publicly and saying, we don't want you, Hezbollah. Thank you, but no thank you. You're just, here to stage this Shiite revolution as an arm of the Iranian revolution. You're destroying our country. We get a lot of challenges, and thank you, but no thank you, on the one hand. On the other hand, they're political power players in Lebanon. Its aim is essentially the elimination of the state of Israel. Hard to have a neighbor who is determined that their main purpose in life is to destroy you. Not so easy. And you can see in the manifesto, when the organization was founded in 85, our struggle will end only when Israel is obliterated. Okay, nice, maybe we Israelis should sit down and have coffee with them, and maybe we can work things out. I like to be an optimist, but realistically, this is a terror organization that theologically is motivated to remove the Jewish state from the globe, period. What it does is it takes a lot of money from Iran. Most Western countries, including America, recognize it as a terror organization. It has blood on its hands from murdering not just Israelis, lots of Lebanese, even Americans and American Marines who were killed in Beirut in the 1980s, probably by Hezbollah as well. And in recent years, they've been very involved in supporting the regime of President Assad, the brutal, ruthless dictator in Syria, just around the corner. And in fact, this came out, I think, last summer. Here is a cartoon in a Lebanese newspaper. This is here Hassan Nasrallah. You see the happy birthday behind him. I don't read Arabic, but it says happy birthday, 59, just 2 years older than me. I guess he doesn't get the exercise or get as much vitamin D as I do, because he's pictured because he lives underground in a bunker. Since the May of 2000 war in Lebanon, Nasrallah has been living underground. But yet his people, as I say, are part and parcel of the Lebanese government. Here you can see in the spring of this year, he was coughing, and there were rumors spreading that he had corona. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't, who knows. But I put this image up here to give you a sense of what we call in Hebrew in the Middle East, a balagan, literally chaos in Lebanon. There are about a dozen different religious and ethnic groups. It says other Christian, but there are, 10% of the population are made up of like 6 or 7 different Christian denominations. Greek Orthodox, Greek Catholic, Armenian Orthodox, Armenian Catholic, for example. It used to be a country that was much more Christian. Today, it's the Maronites are Catholics. And they're named after Maroon, an old bishop centuries ago in Lebanon. So about 25% are either Maronite or other Christians. And about 68% are Muslims. And it's unusual because most Arab countries have a Sunni Islamic majority. Only Iraq, Iran, I think maybe Bahrain, small country, and Lebanon are the only countries that actually have a Shiite majority. It wasn't always that way. When Lebanon was founded by the French in 1920, I remember 2 weeks ago, after the First World War, the French government tried constitutionally to create a system wherein there would be a balance of power between all those different denominations. So, and I'll get this wrong, but for example, more or less, there would always be a Maronite Christian president and a Sunni Muslim prime minister and a Shia Muslim speaker of the Majlis, the parliament, and a Druze commander-in-chief of the Lebanese military. And that was the hope. The problem is there hasn't been a census in Lebanon since the French took one in 1920. And the demography has changed significantly. If you know Lebanese in America, for example, the odds are they're Christian. There's a large exodus of Lebanese Christians from the Civil War in 58, the Civil War in 1970, the war in Lebanon in 1982, the war in 85, in 2006, sorry. Lebanon is a mess. There's no outstanding territorial issue between us right there and them. The only issue is that there is a very powerful, some would even say, and himself, Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, just last week said they've got a lot more power than the Lebanese army. And I can't think of any other country in the world where there is a sovereign government, democratically elected, where a minority in that country, politically, the Shia, there are multiple Shia parties. There's another one called Amal, where this party says openly that we have more military strength than the army of our country. Makes no sense. It's like, a militia in Wyoming saying, hey, we're Americans, but you should know, Secretary of Defense, that our militias have more, nuclear submarines and more airplanes and more whatever than all the American army. So we're happy to do things as long as you do things the way we want to do it. That, unfortunately, is the sorry state of Lebanon, which is a disaster waiting to happen. It's happening. It's been happening for years. And of course, why focus on building better schools, providing better health, when you can raise money for the poor children who are being massacred by the civil war in Yemen? Right? This is an event by Hezbollah, November 3 years ago, exactly. And here they are sitting, raising money. There's their flag. And in front of them, as they walk up to the podium to speak, they're going to trample on the American, Big Satan, and the Israeli flag, Little Satan. Those are our neighbors, unfortunately, to the north. If only we could get along a little bit better with them. Fast forward 1 year. In the context still of the war in Lebanon, there is a protest in Jerusalem. Emil Grunzweig, a reserve officer in the paratroop brigade, someone who has a lot of skin in the game, who had served in Lebanon, was killed by another Jewish Israeli protester by a grenade. And shortly thereafter, Menachem Begin realized his wife, Eliza, had passed away. He felt very upset by what had happened in Lebanon and how Sharon had pulled the wool over his eyes. He said, I no longer function like I used to. Leave me alone. I wish to resign. And ultimately, he stepped down in August of 1983, and Yitzhak Shamir took over as number 2 in the Likud party. The next summer, there were elections. Labor Party on the left, led by Shimon Peres. The Likud on the right, led by Shamir, pretty much ended in a tie, 44 to 41 seats, altogether 85 out of 120 seats. They decided to create a national unity government. You remember last week there was an emergency government created after just before the 6-Day War, where Begin and the political right came in. This was a choice of the leaders of the two major parties, representing 3/4 of the voters. Let's sit together. Rabin was the defense minister, and there was a rotation, right? First Peres was prime minister, and then it was Shamir. And ultimately, the government set two goals. One was to deal with inflation, which by then, in the mid-'80s, had reached over 400% a year. I mean, that's 30%. That's 1% a day. In other words, if you want to buy a sandwich on Monday, November 1st, it's going to cost you 10 shekels. But by the end of the month, November 30th, if I remember the 30 days, I think 30 days, 30 days in November, your sandwich is going to go 1% every single day. So that 10 shekels becomes a lot more money by the end of the month. And so money really had no value. The second issue, as I mentioned before, was withdrawing most of the soldiers from Lebanon, maintaining a small little security presence. In a bracket, by the way, I went up to Jerusalem with a friend of mine, a colleague of mine from where I live, Modi'in, for a protest of people in the tour industry. Israel is opening up on November 1st, but the parameters of this scheme, it's a scheme more than a plan, are just really hard to live up to. And so there was a major protest, and ultimately, and on the way, my friend was saying, oh, yesterday in the mail, he's 50, I got a notice thanking me, a letter recognizing my service in Lebanon. Now, Israel withdrew in 2000. In other words, he in his late teens, early 20s, that was his formative military experience when he was serving in Tzahal, in the Israel Defense Force in southern Lebanon. And there are lots of people. It was a very traumatic period. I compare it to Vietnam, but there are lots of differences. It's our backyard. It's not the other side of the world. It's not the domino theory. These are people who are trying to push us into the sea and their neighbors. It's complicated, but it's still, and there are a lot of TV shows and movies you might have seen. Beaufort in recent years. There's a TV series, I forget its name, on Netflix about it as well. Quite traumatic period. At the same time in 84, by the way, this operation, the first of two operations to bring Jews from Ethiopia begins. Operation Moses, it was called. 8,000 Jews brought. Ultimately, the U.S. helps out, bringing cargo planes. People walked from Ethiopia to Sudan. There they were airlifted to Israel. 86, and this is a time I was in Israel, actually, I remember it distinctly. Anatoly Sharansky, today Natan Sharansky, the former head of the Jewish Agency, is released. He walks across the Leinica Bridge, remember, between East Berlin and West Berlin in a zigzag fashion. And at the airport, who welcomes him? I'm putting the picture up over here. They welcome him, the Prime Minister, Peres, and the Foreign Minister, Shamir, in a rare moment of camaraderie. That year as well, the famous story of Mordechai Vanunu, the former Israeli employee of the Dimona nuclear plant, arrested by the Mossad. He sold 60 pictures to the Sunday Times. He claimed that Israel had a few hundred atomic bombs, convicted of espionage, spent 18 years, in solitary confinement. Still isn't allowed to leave Israel, ultimately converted to Christianity. Unfortunately, later that year, there was an incident in southern Lebanon where an Israeli Air Force plane was shot down in Lebanon, and the pilot and the navigator, this is the navigator, Ron Arad, both parachuted out. The pilot was extricated by my son's unit, the search and rescue of the Air Force, and unfortunately, Ron Arad was captured. We still do not know what's happened to him. 2 weeks ago, our prime minister from the rostrum of the Knesset said, we are seeking new information on the disappearance of Ron Arad. Most people think that he's dead. He's buried somewhere. Will we eventually be able to have his bones brought back to Israel? It's a distinct possibility and a prayer, I think, and hope of all of us. But as the widow said, it's not worth risking even a single person's life in order to bring the bones of my husband home. The next year, one of the most important events happens since Israeli independence, I believe, and that is the Intifada. Intifada is an Arab word from shaking off, as in Arabic literally, as you're trying to, as a dog tries to shake a flea off of its body. And it was an Arabic term coined by young men, mostly in Gaza and the West Bank, rock throwers, Molotov cocktail throwers, when a wave of violence was precipitated by a car accident where a number of Palestinian workers were killed. Rumors quickly spread that it was intentional, premeditated murder. Gaza and then the West Bank erupt in riots. And these riots are not riots that are by the PLO. These are spontaneous riots by young men, mostly. Yitzhak Rabin, defense minister, is in the States at the time, and his response back to Israel is break their bones. They're kids, he was told. Well, don't shoot at them, don't bring tanks, but break their bones. Not so easy to do. And the pictures, of course, that you're familiar with, of young boys throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails. We look the bad guy. They look that, they're the little David. They don't have any weapons. We've got sophisticated weapons. Ultimately, it became a major turning point. And many Israelis, I think, for the first time, 20 years after 1967, realized the challenge of ruling over so many Palestinian people. Many in Israel refer to as the occupation. Many don't like that term. But if you read, for example, Micha Goodman, the fellow at the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, he wrote a book a few years ago called Catch 67, in which he essentially says that Israel's problem is that we are in a dilemma. Like Joseph Heller in Catch 22, there's no way out. 70% of Israelis, Micha Goodman tells us, believe that the occupation is destroying Israel internally, morally, philosophically, theologically. But 70% of Israelis believe that we cannot leave the West Bank / Judea Samaria, because if we do, it would represent an existential threat to the future existence of a state of Israel. And he sums it up by saying, listen, there's very few issues where you can find 70% of Israelis agreeing on something, but they agree on contradictory statements. We can't end the occupation, but we can't, right? We can't stay and we can't go, quite simply. And that, I think, in 1987 was the watershed that struck many Israelis as realizing that the situation isn't tenable. At about the time in early 1988, Hamas, a new organization, we got Hezbollah in 1985 in Lebanon, export of Iran, Shiite, and now we have an export from Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood, a fundamentalist group which has been the opposition for many years in Lebanon. They were the group that killed President Sadat in 1981. They were the ones who democratically elected after Mubarak and the Arab Spring in 2011 was deposed. And so this organization funds a brother, literally, movement called the Movement of Islamic Resistance. Its acronym is Hamas, in 1988. It's committed to rule Islamically, and they're Sunnis. So in Lebanon, Hezbollah is Shiite, funded by Iran. Hamas in Gaza, and a little bit in the West Bank, but more powerful in Gaza, is a Sunni religious Muslim group. And their idea, of course, is twofold. One is they think that they are the ones who should get rid of the PLO, this secular nationalist movement, and they are the ones who should be the leaders of the Palestinians. Engage in jihad, armed struggle in this case, against Israel, quote, and corrupt and degenerate elements in Palestinian society. Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas. There is no solution, as their charter says, for the Palestinian question, except through jihad. Now, jihad is struggle. You can interpret it as theological, you can interpret it as military. Here, it's definitely by force. Initiatives, proposals, and international conferences are all a waste of time and vain endeavors. As Article 6 of its charter says, we strive to raise the banner of Allah over every inch of Palestine. Now, let there be no misunderstanding here. Get rid of the Jews, get rid of the Jewish state, and then get rid of anybody else in Palestine, Palestinians, who don't accept religious, fundamentalist, theological Islam. Most of the enlightened world, the EU, Canada, Israel, America, etc., Japan even, recognize Hamas as a terror organization. However, in 2006, there were elections in Gaza and the West Bank. Arafat died in 2004. There were elections for president. Mahmoud Abbas won. He hasn't been reelected, by the way, in 17 years. That's what happens in the Middle East. And the Hamas party took over, won the elections in Gaza. The next year, they had a military coup. Muslim, Arab, Palestinian against Muslim, Arab, Palestinian in Gaza, where hundreds of PLO people affiliated with Arafat and Abbas, were killed by Hamas. And ever since 2007, there have actually been two Palestinian governments. So, the cynics in Israel say, oh, you want a two-state solution? You got one. You got Hamas Stan over there in Gaza, and you got Fatah land over there in the West Bank. Hamas, the political and religious terror organization in Gaza, and in the West Bank, you've got Fatah. America deals with Fatah, the PLO in the West Bank. Israel deals with them as well. Most of the world deals with them because most of the world recognizes the PLO as the legitimate political leadership of the Palestinian people. Hamas, however, is a terror organization. And so most countries don't deal with them. But there's a big issue because Hamas gets funding from Qatar in the Persian Gulf. And there are 2 million Palestinians in horrible economic conditions of abject poverty in Gaza, who for many years were reliant on working in Israel. And in recent months, I should say, Israel has allowed more Palestinians from Gaza to work in Israel every single day. My eldest son is a contractor. His employees are Palestinian workers who come from the West Bank every single day to work in Israel. They've got permits. They go through the security clearance and everything every day. And there are about 120,000 from the West Bank. Now there are probably 5,000 to 10,000 in recent months who are coming across every single day to work in Israel. So yes, we don't deal directly with the government, but then how is it if the government over on that side is the one controlling who comes and who goes? We have to somehow deal with them in some way, shape, or form to allow those that Israel has had go through security clearance cross a Hamas-controlled checkpoint to leave Gaza and to come in Israel and to do the opposite when they get home. It's a complicated neighborhood here when you try to do business with your neighbors who think you have no legitimate right to exist, whose main purpose is your removal from the neighborhood, but yet you're providing assistance, support, and even jobs to keep their people alive and afloat. It's a crazy world. Anyway, back to internal issues. 1989, Sharansky, as kind of a sign of glasnost, walks across the bridge, as we saw a few minutes earlier. And as the Iron Curtain falls, literally next week as well, November, I think Kristallnacht, November 8th, 9th, is the same night, if I'm not mistaken, of the fall of the Berlin Wall, except this one was in 1989. So it was literally 51 years to the day. The Kristallnacht, 38, and then the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And as a result of this, and the eventual demise, dissolution, call it demise too, but the dissolution of the Soviet Union, they would call the former Soviet Union, the FSU, over 1 million Jews leave the former Soviet Union and immigrate to Israel. Come to my gym. I guarantee you language number 2 after Hebrew spoken in my gym is Russian. Language number 3 is English. And language number 4 is Arabic. Only in Israel, what can I tell you? But here you see the picture of people coming down the gangplank of El Al airplanes, carrying, in many cases, pretty much all that they had. And you'll see these 2 pictures I put up here. I love this because there's no question that the immigration of the former Soviet Union changed Israel drastically. At the time, it increased the Jewish population by 1/5. That's huge, massive. Nothing has ever happened like this outside of the 2 years, 48 to 50, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, the trebling of the doubling of the population in the first 3 years and the trebling in a decade. But what happened in the 1990s was this massive wave of people come to Israel, huge impact politically, huge impact culturally, in terms of technology, startup nation, high tech, a lot of scientists, a lot of doctors. And I can tell you, my wife is an English teacher. And as we speak, she's downstairs, the room underneath me. I think she's finished now, but she teaches Hebrew speakers. And I'd say about 65% of her students are children of immigrants in the former Soviet Union from over 20 years ago, who really, really want to invest in their kids' education and are willing to, pay money for a private tutor in something that, 3rd grade kids learning English to improve their English skills. It's absolutely phenomenal. So it's a huge impact on Israel. And one of the more famous artists, Zoya Cherkeska, I always make her mispronounce her last name, famous in Israel, had an exhibit at the Israel Museum a few years ago. And as I was putting this presentation together, I realized I found this picture on the internet. And you see the woman and the child with the fur hat, and totally inappropriate for Israel weather. You can see them coming down the gangplank with their Russian clothing. And there is the land agent, I guess, from El Al with Israeli flags, the palm trees in the background, that tension of the distinction between the world that the Jews in the former Soviet Union are coming from and the world that they're coming to. Lots of cultural issues still as we speak in Israel, but I believe an unprecedented boon to Israel in so many fields. You go around Israel today, for example, this is, I think, in Nazareth, if I'm not mistaken. I don't remember where it is, but you'll see the sign. It says Yerokot v'perot Golan, fruits and vegetables from the Golan. You know, free delivery. There's the phone number. I should block it out so nobody will call it anyway. And it's in Russian. Why? Because in certain communities, Nazareth elite, for example, there are huge numbers of immigrants from the former Soviet Union. Keep in mind, 1 out of every 5 people will sit around the table and will speak Russian, some Ukrainian, but Russian around the dinner table, like we would speak English, right? I'm a Canadian originally, my wife's American, our kids are all born here, but that's our natural language. Huge impact in Israel. Go to the Ministry of Interior, where they register everything from births to deaths, and look at the official language of Israel, Hebrew. Arabic, it used to be the official language until a law changed that. Now it's an important or significant language, but it's not the official language, unfortunately. English and Russian. There are actually more people who can understand the Russian than can understand the English, but literally, pardon the pun, a sign of the times in Israel today. Development of non-kosher, a series of not just restaurants, but supermarket chain, a whole supermarket chain that caters to immigrants from the former Soviet Union. At the same time that 250,000 Jews are coming in 1990, that's 20,000 a month. That's a lot of people, right? That's 700 a day at Ben Gurion Airport. Crazy. Saddam Hussein invades Iraq. Saddam Hussein of Iraq, invades Kuwait. And you all know why. President George Bush managed to form this international coalition across the board. Russia and America in the same military coalition, first time that it happened since the end of the Cold War, since the beginning of the Cold War, in the end of the Second World War, And Arab countries, Egypt, Russia, Syria, all united against Saddam Hussein. Why? Because everyone knew it was important to preserve the democratic integrity of Kuwait. Oh, sorry, did I say that wrong? Oh, everyone knew it was important to ensure the stability of the world's largest deposits of petroleum in the Persian Gulf. Yeah. Anyway, Saddam Hussein says, listen, if you attack me, I'm going to attack Israel. Israel was not involved in the coalition, and we stayed out of the coalition. We were given gas masks at the time, take them with us wherever we go, because we didn't know what was in those rockets that Saddam Hussein was threatening to shoot at us. And ultimately what happens, they shot 47 rockets at us after Operation Desert Storm was launched in January of 1991, 39 missiles, as I mentioned, from Western Iraq. Israel didn't retaliate. President Bush very clearly told our Prime Minister Shamir, listen, if you attack, we'll destroy the coalition and it'll all be over. You cannot get involved. We will give you Patriot missiles to protect us, thankfully, to protect you, but we don't get involved militarily. Ultimately, what happened? Only one person miraculously was killed by the rocket attacks. It's phenomenal. An Iron Dome that we have today to protect us is much better than the Patriot was. 1991, at the end of the year, there was a peace conference in Madrid, initiated by America and by Russia. Phenomenal again. No more Cold War. 2 major countries trying to figure out how to end, who had, as we saw in previous sessions that I did, who were at loggerheads in the Middle East. It was American planes versus Soviet planes, Soviet rockets against American anti-rocket technology. Amazing. And all of a sudden they're sitting down. And as I said, Dan Meridor, from the senior member of the Israeli delegation, said, historically, the Madrid conference was a turning point in the history of the Middle East conflict. And it was, because for the first time, Israel sat down with bilateral issues with our neighbors. There you can see pictures. Some of you remember, I was in Jerusalem at the time, my wife or girlfriend at the time. Our nephew was born January 23rd, I'll never forget it, 1991. As the sirens went off in Jerusalem, there you can see the Patriot missiles, and we were taking care of their dog, My sister-in-law was in labor in a hospital in Jerusalem with a gas mask. Thankfully, my nephew was not damaged by that by that operation, but it was quite a traumatic period. I remember not knowing what the nature of those rockets were, whether they were atomic or biological or chemical, and of course, not really having a really good, effective method of protecting ourselves. Next year, just after the war, but before the peace conference, there was an operation. A second wave of Jews from Ethiopia, 36 hours over the weekend. Almost 15,000 Jews were evacuated to Israel, 747s where they took up the seats. Within a couple of days, the American Jewish community, and many of you maybe, were very involved in raising the money necessary, in a sense, tragically, basically to pay ransom to the Ethiopian government in the midst of a violent civil war going on. We removed 14,000 of our landsmen, as they say in Ethiopian, the only Western country, to my knowledge, that spent taxpayers and world Jewry money in order to bring Black people out of Africa, not to enslave them, but in order to bring them home. Here's some of the amazing pictures of the airplanes where they took the seats out, and here you can see the world record was broken twice on one airplane. Over 1,000 people, right? 1,086 people took off, but 2 were born. So they broke the record 3 times. The first time, 1,066 people on the plane, 86. And then a couple hours later, baby 1 is born, 87. And then another one is born, 88. 2 births on the plane. I was recently in May, because it was the 30th anniversary, there was a TV special on it. And I was watching it, and they interviewed the doctor who was a volunteer doctor in the IDF in my son's unit, the 669 Search and Rescue Unit. And I know, because they have this symbol is a cat with these 2 big green eyes, and he's wearing a shirt. And I'm like, oh. And he delivered 2 babies. And guess what? They introduced the doctor, who wasn't even a gynecologist, who delivered, an obstetrician, sorry, who delivered these babies en route from Ethiopia to Israel. And he met them as 30-year-old adults. It was very, very, very powerful moment. But, still, there are challenges, of course, 150,000 Jews in Ethiopia, in Israel today, huge challenges. But again, yes, there is racism, but nothing compared to what exists in most Western countries, largely because, again, the foundation of the bringing of Jews from Ethiopia to Israel is to bring our brothers and sisters who have been apart from us for 2,700 years since the destruction of the first temple, to bring them to be home with us here in the Jewish state. As I said, the Madrid Peace Conference, sponsored by Spain and by Russia and by the United States. And what was amazing is that the idea was to have direct negotiations between the parties, bilateral, one-on-one. There was Israeli, Syrian, Lebanese, Egyptian, even though we had peace with them, and a joint Palestinian-Jordanian delegation. And it really was incredible, because not only did they have meetings, but they established a framework for further discussions. Here you can see some of the lead figures. There is the guy with the tattoo on his forehead, Mikhail Gorbachev. There is President George Bush Sr. There is Yitzhak Shamir. Where is he? Where is Yitzhak Shamir? There's Yitzhak Shamir behind him, sorry. And there's James Baker. And here you can see President Bush speaking. You can see over there, that is the Prime Minister Shamir. And behind him, where is he? Where is he? Yeah, and this man over here with the red tie, it's very hard to see. That is Prime Minister Netanyahu. Oh, there it is, sorry. That is Netanyahu. Then he was a member of the Prime Minister's delegation, and there is Yitzhak Shamir, 1991. Ultimately, what happened, Israel went on a track and signed peace with Jordan in 94. I'm getting ahead of myself, and went on a secret track with the PLO and signed another agreement in 93. Israel may be coming off of this euphoria of these elections, of the Madrid Peace Conference. Hey, the Cold War is over. The Arab-Israeli conflict is no longer an issue. It's now bilateral issues between Israel and each of its neighbors. The Soviets and Americans aren't playing, political ping pong and military ping pong in the Middle East. And there was a real sense of optimism in Israel that ultimately, in the elections of June of the following year, led to the election of the political left for the first time since 1977, right? They had been a government of national unity between 84 and 88, I said a few minutes ago. Clearly, the left won. They got 44 seats. Shamir's Likud party got 32 seats. Previously, it would have been pretty much a tie in the previous elections. Rabin introduced commander-in-chief of Israel's defense forces in 67 Six-Day War, former ambassador to Washington, prime minister in the 70s for 3 years after Golda resigned, you remember, really Mr. Security, had been defense minister 87 to for 2 years, 88, and now he had a lot of credibility, seen as Mr. Security. And once again, the same guy we saw last week, Chaim Yavin, Mr. Walter Cronkite and Harry Reasoner, and I forget the other guy, all in one. Dan Rather, maybe no. And he said, there's another Rabin. Rabin at his victory speech said, Ani anavet, ani achlit, ani achriya, ani achlit. I will navigate, I will determine, I will decide. And from a position of soldier number one, a lot of confidence Israelis had in him. Ultimately, Shimon Peres, his defense minister, pushes toward the secret channel in Oslo, in Norway. And as Peres describes later to Rabin and to me, the Oslo Agreement was a moral decision. We felt that Israel was strong enough to stop ruling over others. When negotiations start with the opposite side, it appears that what we are looking for is a middle ground, namely a compromise. And ultimately, he continues, the agreement was a revolution in a land where the majority are conservative. He's right. Israelis are more conservative / traditional than progressive liberal. It's very different than America, where 67, 75% of Americans are general liberal. Here it's very different. That is why this agreement is controversial, revolution. As we make progress toward the future, we will come to realize that is the only true option, because only a true understanding between us will secure a true peace. And of course, when the handshake, shall I say coerced, shall I say forced by President Clinton on the White House lawn, September 13th, 93, Arafat on the right, you see the look on the face of Yitzhak Rabin, not love. Listen, he's the enemy. We've got to make peace with the enemy. I was a soldier for so many years. That's what we have to do now. Ultimately, they signed the Declaration of Principles. Israel recognized the PLO, a big thing. Founded in 1964, this terror organization, whose aim was to liberate Palestine through military force, all of a sudden we recognize them as the legitimate political leadership of the Palestinians. Israel will withdraw from parts of the West Bank, and we'll have negotiations. We'll start negotiations that over 5 years will lead to a final peace treaty between us and the Palestinians. At the same time, the PLO pledged to make peace, stop terrorism, and eliminate a clause in their covenant that called for our destruction. Peres, Rabin on the right, Peres in the middle, and Arafat were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize a year later, which they accepted in December of 1994. The first part of the agreement implemented after the Oslo Accords was called the Gaza-Jericho First Agreement. Why? Because Israel said to the Palestinians, listen, here is all of Israel. This area, light blue, is the West Bank. This is Gaza. We've been in a state of conflict for many years. Let us slowly develop this relationship. We will give you limited autonomy in parts of Gaza where Palestinians live. We will retain certain areas, these darker colors, where the Jews live, and the same in the West Bank. And Jericho, an exclusive Palestinian city, we will give you autonomy. You'll have autonomy. You can control things inside your territory, including security. And a number of security forces were established in Gaza and the West Bank, so that you see this hodgepodge of colors. There's Jerusalem. There's Jerusalem right there. There's the Dead Sea, Tel Aviv, of course. Here is Judea, Samaria, the West Bank. The blue will be Israeli controlled, and the yellow and the brown will be Palestinian controlled. Now, why are they two different colors? Well, the major urban areas, Ramallah here, Jericho, Bethlehem, Hebron, Nablus, Jenin, Tulkaram, Kalkilia, Jenin up over there, those urban areas are yellow, and those are those area A. I put this little chart up there to show you it's as simple as that old Jackson 5 song, A, B, C. Well, area A are areas where exclusive Palestinian population lives, and in those areas, parts of the West Bank and almost all of the Gaza Strip, the Palestinian Authority will have security as well as civil control, collect garbage, taxation, education, licensing, etc. The other areas, area B, which would be in this map here, the brown areas, are rural areas where Palestinians exclusively live, no Jews live there either, And in those areas, the Palestinian Authority will have civic control, taxes, education, but not security. Israel maintains security in Area B. And finally, in Area C, where there are about 100, now it's probably 150,000 Palestinians and close to 500,000 Israelis in about 130 settlements, is full Israeli control. A plus B plus C, go back to the map, sorry, I'm not making you too busy. The blue is C, Israeli controlled. The yellow is A, Palestinian controlled. And the brown is Palestinian and Israeli controlled. Palestinian civic and Israeli security control. All of that is the West Bank. And the idea of the Oslo Accords is, let's see how much of C will become B, Israeli controlled will be shared, how much of shared B will become A, fully Palestinian control. And that was the idea of the Oslo Accords. It continued from 1994 until 1999-2000, when Israel finally and the Palestinians met, you'll see soon, at Camp David in the summer of 2000 to discuss the 5 most challenging issues. Jerusalem, who will control it? Will it be one city, internationalized? Will it be 2 cities? If so, who's going to have access to the holy sites in the old city? 2, settlements in the West Bank. 3, the final borders, water, and refugee issues. And those were the discussions in Camp David. Those are the discussions that eventually were held in Camp David. We'll see in just a couple of minutes' time. In the meantime, Israel is having discussions with the Palestinians, but with Jordan, Israel reaches a full peace agreement in October of 1994. Israeli Prime Minister Rabin, King Hussein of Jordan, and President Clinton sign this treaty in no man's land between Israel and Jordan. Rabin, quoting a great American, maybe, "I have but one dream, to give the next generation a better and a more peaceful world." And his counterpart, King Hussein, there you can see, people always say, there's Rabin signing on the left, Prime Minister of Israel. There is Clinton in the middle. And there is the, I forget his name, the Jordanian Prime Minister. There's the king. Why isn't the king signing it? Because it's an agreement between governments, and the representative of government is the Prime Minister rather than the king. Protocol. Anyway, Hussein said the following: "This is the day in which hopes, promises, and determination shall prevail. We, all the children of Abraham, shall cherish and remember this day, which is the dawn of a new era of peace." And the handshake, you can see Rabin is smiling a lot more here than he was when he was forced to shake the hand of Yasser Arafat. And Israeli and Jordanian school children released blue and white and red and black and red and white and green and black. Sorry, red? Yeah, whatever, the colors of the Jordanian flag. Red, green, black, and white. Balloons. My niece and nephew living in nearby kibbutz released some of those balloons. I'm not sure which one, but some of those balloons back then in 1994. And tragically, as the step toward more negotiations with the Palestinians was dividing Israel internally over yes to give up land, no to give up land, we're jeopardizing Jewish lives. Palestinian terror began to increase, more terror incidents, more suicide bombers and coffee shops and buses in the central cities of Israel. And at a rally in Tel Aviv, literally, as I speak, 26 years ago, 2 days from now, right, November 4th, Yitzhak Rabin, Prime Minister, addresses this rally whose slogan was yes to peace, no to violence. And the no to violence was domestic internal Israeli violence over opposition to continued negotiations and the peace process with the Palestinians. And I read from the Prime Minister's last speech. As many of you probably remember where you were when you heard about the murder of Yitzhak Rabin. Violence is eroding the foundation of Israeli democracy. It must be condemned, denounced, and isolated. It is not the way of the state of Israel. Unfortunately, as he was leaving the rally, about to get into his armor-plated vehicle, he was wounded, 3 bullets in very short range, and the bureau chief Eitan Haber said on the news a couple hours later, the Israeli government announces with shock, great sorrow, and profound grief the death of Yitzhak Rabin, who was assassinated in Tel Aviv this evening. May he rest in peace. 2 days later, the funeral with 80 heads of state in attendance, including President Clinton. Clinton eulogized his friend, some might say mentor. The world has lost one of its great men, a fighter for the freedom of his people and for peace. Shalom Chaver. Goodbye, my friend. And Hussein, who later commented on Rabin having received in December the year before his Nobel Prize, said the following. Rabin, his greatest legacy, peace was his greatest legacy, misquote me, for it took a warrior to cross the divide, take courage and meet us halfway. He laid the foundation necessary to heal the wounds. He brought the Middle East closer to peace, and he was Israel's courageous champion of peace. Unfortunately, where would Israel be today? Who knows? He was murdered shortly after he sung the Song of Peace with Miri Aloni, the famous Israeli singer, on the stage in front of maybe 150,000 young Israelis. He folded up the lyrics to the song. He didn't sing very well. He didn't know the song at all. He put it in his breast pocket. And today in the state archives is the original of the lyrics, bloody lyrics of Prime Minister Rabin at the rally in November of 1995. Immediately thereafter, the square, it's actually across the street from where our youngest son is living now, is called Rabin Square. And it became a public kind of place of public mourning. People coming and lighting memorial candles, singing, and a lot of stuff written on the walls. Only one thing was preserved, and that's this. Outside Tel Aviv, you see the inscription in Hebrew and Arabic and English. And it says in Hebrew, Slicha, sorry. Sorry for, and just 2 weeks ago on the Hebrew calendar date of the murder of the prime minister, it's the official state memorial, and there's a lot of political issue around that. Was the political right involved in instigating and demonizing the prime minister that ultimately led to a crazed Israeli, Jewish, law student, soldier, yeshiva graduate, who believed from the teaching of his rabbi that it was incumbent upon him from Jewish law to take the prime minister's life because he was giving away Jewish land and he was jeopardizing Jewish life. It is still one of the major dividers within Israeli society. Terrorism increases, Palestinian terrorism. Israel, led by Shimon Peres, number 2. Peres decides to go to an election, get the approval of the public in spring and summer of 1996. There was more violence. Ultimately, Israel killed the engineer responsible for many of the bomb manufacturing in Gaza, in particular, Yehia Ayash. As a result of that, there was even more terror. And there was growing opposition within Israel to further implementing the Oslo Accords. Listen, Arafat is supposedly our partner, but yet the wave of terrorism is increasing more and more. He's not able to control terrorism. So if we give up more control to Arafat, then we're going to, be at a greater security risk. We can't do that on the one hand. On the other hand, Israeli said, you know what? These are people who, like the radicals within Israel, are more and more opposed to any sort of compromise because it's zero-sum solution. And if we stop the process, we're going to yield to the demands of the terrorists. Israel doesn't negotiate with terrorists. Why would we negotiate with those people who, through murdering Israelis, are showing their opposition to the possibility of living 2 states next to each other? Ultimately, what happens is there is an election. Netanyahu wins it, but Tomi Lapid, the late Tomi Lapid, an Israeli journalist who is also a politician, father of Yair Lapid, our future co-sharing prime minister now, said Netanyahu was elected because the majority of the public, Jewish public, could not accept a deal in which we give up territories while the Palestinians blow up our buses. And in many ways, it's exactly what I just said. I probably borrowed it from him rather than the other way around. We can't vote for more agreement if more Israelis are being killed. And in the first time that Israel had direct elections for Prime Minister, Netanyahu won by less than 30,000 votes. You know how close elections are contested in America. Major change from left to right, but a very, very small percentage number of people directly voting for the Prime Minister. It's at about this time the dot-com bubble is blowing bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And the first major purchase of an Israeli startup was a company called ICQ, as in the letters, but if you say it quickly, ICQ. It was a messenger, online messenger program, and it was bought up by AOL Time Warner for a mere $407 million. Today, that may be pocket change for a guy named Elon Musk. It might mean what he makes is the stock fluctuates in a 30-second period. But this really was the watershed in Israel that a company was bought, a startup from these 4 young guys in their 20s. The father of one of them, Yossi Vardi, a serial venture capitalist, also very successful in the field, and it really began to change the nature of the Israeli economy. Today, about 9% of Israelis work in high tech, but it is a totally different country because of that. And part of the reason Israel was at the right time at the right place had to do with the immigration of the Jews in the former Soviet Union in the decade of the 1990s. By 98, we are celebrating our 50th anniversary. And there really was a sense, I felt it, a palpable sense that, you know what, now we've solved it, we're on the way to solve all of our external issues, peace with Egypt, peace with Jordan, discussions with the Palestinians, maybe even peace with Syria. Hey, maybe we can now focus on our internal issues. And we celebrated our 50th anniversary in 98. Vice President Al Gore, I almost said president, but I wasn't counting the hanging chads in Florida, sorry. Vice President Al Gore came, 1998, Prime Minister Netanyahu, the first time he was prime minister, and of course, we celebrated. And our next two sessions are going to be looking at the period from 1998 to the present, going from, and think about where we've been in the past month. We started with this idea of Zionism, from a prayer to a political movement, to the foundation of society in all of its levels, up until 1948, independence, the challenges of the first 20 years, the continuous wars and the violence, and all of a sudden, we're in a different reality. Ethiopian immigrants coming, immigrants to the former Soviet Union coming, major economic success, peace breaking out on all fronts. Israel is in a very different place in its 50th anniversary, some might say miraculously so, than it was when we were born in 1948. And with that, I turn it over to see if anybody has any questions in the chat. I see none. Oh, I see a question. So Claudia asked me the question, how much, if at all, is the current situation in Lebanon a threat to Israel? That's a good question. It depends who you ask. I will tell you that there are lots of resources being spent to ensure the protection of Israel. You'll see in 2 weeks' time, probably, not next week, I think the week after, I talk about how, starting with the Arab Spring in 2011, Israel has carried out, and the Air Force and the government doesn't really talk about this, hundreds, in the plural, of aerial attacks, including one on Saturday, by the way, of a surface-to-surface missile in Syria, targeting delivery of weapons, including potentially precision-delivered weapons from Iran through Syria to Lebanon that would increase the threat of the Hezbollah rockets, over 100,000 facing us, that aren't precise. If they were to have the technology of precision rockets, we'd be in a real difficult situation. So constant vigilance, constant monitoring, it's like there's this tripwire in the middle of a minefield that any little thing can cause, and you'll see next week the 2006 war in Lebanon, attacking an Israeli patrol, 3 soldiers killed in Israel, 2 kidnapped, and 33-day operation ensues, and 150 Israelis are dead, and 1,000, 2,000 Palestinian, Lebanese, sorry. So constant vigilance, and I think Israelis go to bed at night knowing that we've got threats, but we also feel comfortable that Israel is able to ensure our protection. Big issue in terms of Lebanon. I see another question over here in the chat. Could I summarize the dates and amounts of major waves of immigration to Israel? Well, I did. I have to go back to all my presentations. I don't remember exact numbers. I will tell you from 1880 to 1914, about 70,000 Jews came. From 1919 until 1923, turn this off, to 1923, another maybe 100,000 Jews came, another 250,000 came by 48. So by 48, there were about 650,000 Jews. 48 to 58, that number trebled. So about 1.2 million Jews came in a decade, European Holocaust survivors and Jews from all across the Middle East. There were petering in of immigrations from Romania in the 60s, for example, from America. 3,000 Jews made Aliyah in the years after the 6-Day War. But until the 80s and the big immigration from Ethiopia, Now there are 150,000 Ethiopian Israelis, and the immigration of the former Soviet Union. There were no major waves really besides those first early decades. Let's see another question here. Okay. So already done. Okay, good. Other questions? The immigrant question got me thinking, because America is a society that is built on immigration, but yet today one of the critical issues dividing Americans is over immigration. And when I try to compare and contrast Israel to America or any other country, they're very different societies. And so in Israel, it's very clear that immigration of Jews from wherever is a priority. One of the raison d'etre of the state of Israel, as I said a month ago, is, in our opening session, is to provide a safe haven for Jews in need from anywhere in the world, on the one hand. On the other hand, to provide a place where Jews can be creative and live Jewishly, as we haven't had for 2,000 years anywhere in the world. And as such, I think that, look at what's happening in Europe today with immigration. Should they have immigration? Not. It's one of the major issues in France in particular, and Germany in particular, when Angela Merkel unilaterally let in 1,000 refugees from Syria, mostly a few years ago. But in Israel, we do not have that discussion of Jews, I should say, coming in from anywhere else in the rest of the world. And remember last week, Begin, short after he was elected in the spring of '77, he let in 300 Vietnamese boat people. The question is, how long can Israel sustain immigration from an environmental point of view? Look, I'll say it slower. How long, Claudia asked me, how long can Israel sustain immigration from an environmental point of view? I ask you as Californians, 40 million Californians? Huge. You're more people in California than in Canada. How long can California sustain continued growth? Is it immigration? Is it childbirth? The British in 1937 believed that there was no room for more than 2 million people between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. No more. Today, Israel has 9.3 million citizens. There are 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, 2.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank. That is 4.5, 5, 14 million people live in the area between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. 7 times what the British thought could live here not that long ago. And so the question is, as one of the most densely populated developed countries in the world, how long can Israel sustain continued immigration growth? I don't think there are that many more pools of Jews who are immigrating to Israel. If you look at the fact that there are 14, 15 million Jews in the world, about 6 now, almost 7 now live in Israel. No, 7 about live in Israel. About 5.5, 6, depending on who's counting, live in America. That leaves what, another million and a half Jews, 2 million? That's it. So there's a question in terms of growth, but I think Israel will ensure that whenever and wherever Jews are in need, they will have a welcome home and a place to basically look after them as Jews in the world. So there are internal issues in terms of how we build in Israel today, how we deal with the environment. Should we build more tall buildings? Should we allow people to live the Israeli dream and live in a house on the ground floor with 2 parking spaces and a garage like in suburban America? Those are internal dilemmas. And I will say that, and thank you for that question, Claudia, because there is definitely a sense of environmentalism. There's a movement and there are loads of environmental organizations in Israel that didn't exist. They really blossomed in the last 20 years because we had a lot more energy to focus on internal issues rather than on external security issues. I see one question from Robin. Is there an overall Ethiopian feeling about their place in Israeli society? Is there an overall Ethiopian feeling about their place in Israeli society? Look, my youngest son, who I think might be Ethiopian in mentality, at least, why he's really fast. I mean, literally, he's very fast, and he's the fastest. And he would compete in high school, and he would usually lose to Israelis of Ethiopian origin. He loves Ethiopian food. He loves Ethiopian music. And that's one of 9.3 million Israelis on the one hand. On the other hand, there is racism. There is bigotry toward the other. So who is the other in Israel? They're Jews and they're Arabs. But most Israeli Jews don't interact with Israeli Arabs because of where we live. So they're veteran Israelis and they're newcomers. Oh, you newcomers from Russia. You know, when I came in 1952 from Morocco, I got nothing. The government sent me down to the Negev. And when you came in 1992, you got a bag of cash from the government of Israel when you arrived at the airport. You Russian Jews, you're taking the system as far as it can go. So you've got that. Every wave of newcomer in an immigrant society is always oftentimes looked at negatively. You've got the biological differences of skin color, obviously. And I will not gloss over the challenges of Israeli society, knowing that there is still racism in Israeli society. The number of university graduates amongst Ethiopians is the lowest among any sector in Israeli society. Remember, many of the immigrants who came here in the 80s and 90s were illiterate, the parents. Not all, but many of them were. And so it's huge, huge challenges. We've now got, colonels in the army who are Ethiopian, and judges and doctors and public figures and members of the Knesset. So it's a generational thing. But again, there never was institutionalized racism and or slavery in Israel. Doesn't mean that there isn't discrimination against them. The Black Lives Matter movement in America, for example, bizarrely, Palestinian nationalists identify with Black Lives Matter, not Israeli Ethiopians. Doesn't go there. And for example, to give you one other, because I talked about BLM, but if you look at one of the big differences in America and Israel, in America, Black Lives Matter, one of their goals, or some of the people in this big umbrella organization, is to defund the police. In Israel, the Palestinian Israelis have the exact opposite beef. They want to increase funding and increase police presence in their towns because they are only 21% of Israeli population, but over 100 Arab Israelis have died in international Arab, not Palestinian West Bank or Gaza, domestic violence within their towns, which is more than the rest of Israel. It's crazy. And so you've got huge differences between the two societies. Again, we're an immigrant society, you're an immigrant society. Our raison d'etre continues to be led in Jewish immigrants. Your raison d'etre is continually being challenged as to whether or not immigrants should come in. So very, very different. All right, I've taken up 17 minutes for questions. I think I am going to say goodbye to all of you. Until we meet again next week, we're going to be doing 1998 until about 2010, 2011. Hannah, are you still there? If you are, goodbye. If not, all of you, I'll see you next week. Bye.